The Grand Convergence was one of those massive diplomatic gatherings where hundreds of species met annually for formal negotiations and cultural exchange on neutral space stations. James Sullivan attended as a cultural liaison officer. His job was to facilitate interactions between newly arrived human delegations and established galactic civilizations, making sure humans didn't commit major diplomatic blunders and helping other species understand humanity's perspectives. James was 36, 12 years into diplomatic services, genuinely interested in other cultures and good at making people comfortable in social situations. The convergence included a formal ball as part of its programming, an event where species mixed informally, where political tensions could ease through shared cultural experiences. The ballroom was magnificent, decorated to accommodate dozens of species' aesthetic preferences, with music that blended multiple cultural traditions. James circulated among delegations, facilitating introductions, helping ease social awkwardness that occurred when species with very different customs tried to interact. During the ball, James noticed a woman sitting alone at the edge of the ballroom. She was striking, tall and elegant with pale features, dressed in formal attire that was beautiful but somewhat archaic in style. What caught his attention wasn't just her appearance but her isolation. The area around her was notably empty despite the crowded ballroom. People gave her a wide berth, and when anyone's path took them near her, they noticeably altered course. James's professional instincts told him this was exactly the kind of social exclusion his job was meant to address. Someone isolated at a diplomatic function represented a failure of the event's purpose to facilitate connection between species. He approached her with friendly courtesy, introduced himself, and asked if she'd like to dance. The woman's reaction was complex, surprise that registered almost as shock, followed by wariness or confusion. "Do you know who I am?" Her tone suggested this was a significant question. James admitted he didn't, but explained that wasn't really relevant to whether she'd like to dance. She'd been sitting alone while everyone else socialized, and he thought she might enjoy some company. After a long pause where she seemed to be assessing him, she accepted. "I am Saris Velnath," she introduced herself, and they moved to the dance floor. The moment they began dancing, James noticed several things. Saris was an excellent dancer, moving with grace suggesting centuries of practice. The crowd parted around them significantly, creating much more space than necessary. Conversations and music seemed to quiet, as if people were paying attention despite trying not to obviously stare. He also noticed Saris's skin was unusually cool to the touch, and there was something about her presence that triggered very slight unease, not enough to make him uncomfortable, but enough that he recognized it as probably species-related. Throughout the dance, Saris was initially quite formal and reserved, but as James continued treating her with the same friendly warmth he'd show anyone, she began to relax slightly. "Why are you not afraid of me?" she asked. James responded honestly that he didn't know enough about her to be afraid. "Should I be concerned?" Saris's answer was cryptic. Many species would say yes, but she seemed intrigued that James had approached her without that fear. After the dance, Saris didn't immediately return to her isolated position. Instead, she walked with James to a quieter area where they could actually talk. She asked about his role at the Convergence, and James explained his work as a cultural liaison, helping facilitate connections, smoothing over misunderstandings, making sure no one felt excluded. "Do you always approach isolated individuals at social functions?" Saris asked, finding this fascinating and somewhat ironic. James explained honestly. He'd noticed she was sitting alone in a way that seemed like deliberate exclusion rather than personal choice, and the wide berth people gave her suggested active avoidance. His job was partly to identify and address those situations. Sarah studied him carefully, then told him something she found both amusing and significant. "You have been dancing with one of the most feared individuals in this sector of space." "I am Velkari, what humans know as vampires. More specifically, I am Velkari royalty, a queen who has ruled my people for over 8 centuries. She explained that the Velkari were feared across the sector, not because they were mindlessly violent, but because they were apex predators who could be extremely dangerous, and because their feeding requirements made other species fundamentally uncomfortable. Velkari queens particularly were considered terrifying, the most powerful of their species, ones who'd survived centuries of internal politics. James processed this with characteristic pragmatism. Were you attending as part of official Velkari diplomatic delegation? Saris explained she attended most major diplomatic gatherings as an observer and occasional participant in negotiations involving Velkari interests. However, her presence usually created tension. Other species were uncomfortable around her, feared her capabilities, preferred to maintain distance. She rarely participated in social aspects because her presence tended to ruin the atmosphere for others. Why did you accept my invitation if you knew it might create problems? Saris's answer was honest. Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, someone approached me without fear, treating me as simply another person at a social event rather than as a dangerous predator to be avoided. The novelty of that experience was compelling. Over the following hours, James and Saris continued talking. She was remarkably interesting. 8 centuries of life had given her perspectives on galactic history that living beings rarely possessed. She'd witnessed events James had only read about in historical records. James shared his own perspectives on humanity's recent emergence into galactic community, the challenges of cultural liaison work, and his genuine fascination with the diversity of species and cultures. Saris found his perspectives refreshing. Humans were so new to galactic civilization that they hadn't yet developed the deeply ingrained fears that older species had. James's lack of fear wasn't because he was brave or reckless. It was because humans didn't have centuries of cultural conditioning teaching them to fear Velkari. By the end of the evening, Saris told James something significant. Your simple act of inviting me to dance, treating me with normal social courtesy rather than fear-based avoidance, has meant more to me than you probably realize. Centuries of isolation, of being feared, of watching people deliberately avoid me, have been my constant experience. One evening of being treated as simply a person rather than a threat has reminded me of what I've been missing. The grand convergence continued over several days, and James and Saris spent increasing amounts of time together. This didn't go unnoticed, and James started receiving warnings from various representatives about the dangers of associating with a Velkari queen. A senior diplomat pulled James aside to explain that Saris Velneth was not someone to be treated casually. She'd survived Velkari succession conflicts that killed many others, possessed capabilities that made her one of the most dangerous individuals in this sector. Getting too close was risky. James thanked them for the concern, but explained that Saris had been nothing but courteous and interesting. I understand she's powerful and potentially dangerous, but treating her as a pariah because of what she could do rather than what she's actually doing seems counterproductive to diplomatic goals. Saris was aware of the attention their friendship was generating. She offered to maintain distance from James if it was creating professional problems. James's response was characteristic. If my job is to facilitate connections between species and cultures, then forming a genuine friendship with a Velkari queen seems entirely consistent with that mission. I'm going to base my choices on my actual experiences with you rather than on others' fears. This response affected Saris deeply. She'd spent centuries being treated carefully by those who feared her, having interactions shaped by terror of what she represented. James was the first person in longer than she could remember who treated her based on who she was actually being rather than on what he'd been told she could be. Over the days of the convergence, Saris shared more about her life and the loneliness that came with her position. Velkari formed social bonds, value connection and companionship. But my status as queen and the fear I generate in other species have isolated me profoundly. I have subjects who respect my authority, allies who negotiate with me carefully, and enemies who oppose me. But I haven't had a genuine friend, someone who sought my company simply because they enjoyed it in centuries. James asked about Velkari feeding requirements, how they actually sustained themselves, since the fear seemed based partly on misunderstanding. Saris explained that modern Velkari primarily used synthetic blood alternatives or obtained blood through ethical means from willing donors. The predatory image of Velkari hunting other species is mostly historical or based on criminal elements. But the fear persists because it's easier to maintain prejudice than to learn about how species actually function. The convergence included a formal closing ceremony. During this, Saris made an unexpected gesture. She publicly acknowledged James by name, thanking him for demonstrating that new perspectives and genuine kindness could bridge even the oldest divides between species. Coming from a Velkari queen, this public recognition was significant, cementing James's reputation as someone who could form connections across even the most challenging cultural barriers. After the convergence ended, James and Saris faced a question about whether their friendship would continue. They could let it end naturally as they returned to separate lives. Instead, they decided to maintain contact. The connection they'd formed was rare enough that neither wanted to lose it simply due to logistics. Over the following months and years, James and Saris developed a friendship that became increasingly important to both of them. They communicated regularly across the distances of space, met when their duties brought them to the same locations. For Saris, James represented something she'd thought lost forever: uncomplicated companionship, where she didn't have to perform her role as terrifying queen or manage others' fear. She could simply be herself, share her thoughts and feelings, trust that James's responses were genuine rather than calculated based on fear. For James, Saris had become one of his closest friends, someone whose perspective he valued, whose company he genuinely enjoyed, and who had taught him more about galactic history and cross-species dynamics than years of formal education could provide. 1 year after they first met, James was assigned to a diplomatic mission to Velkari space, the first formal human delegation to visit Velkari territories. James requested Saris serve as primary liaison, which meant he'd be staying at her residence. This visit gave James direct experience of Saris's life and position. He saw how other Velkari treated her, with profound respect mixed with wariness, how she carried the weight of centuries of leadership. He also saw how isolated her position kept her. Velkari queens maintained distance from their subjects as part of authority structure, which meant she was surrounded by people, but fundamentally alone. During this visit, Saris admitted something she'd never told anyone. "I'm profoundly tired, not of living, but of the loneliness that comes with my position. I've maintained my role because my people need stable leadership, but the cost has been centuries without genuine connection. Your friendship has reminded me what I've been missing, and while I value it deeply, it also makes the loneliness more acute." James responded with straightforward compassion. If the loneliness is unbearable, what would actually help? Saris's answer revealed vulnerability she rarely showed. "More of what we already have: friendship, genuine connection, someone who sees me as a person. But I recognize this is asking a lot from you." 2 years after they first met, James made a surprising decision. He requested permanent assignment as human liaison to Velkari territories. This was unusual because Velkari space wasn't a priority posting. James argued that establishing stronger human-Velkari relations was strategically valuable, that his friendship with Queen Saris created unique opportunities. His request was approved. James relocated to Velkari space, establishing permanent human diplomatic presence there, allowing him and Saris to maintain their friendship with regular contact. The story ended several years after their first meeting. Saris reflected on how a simple invitation to dance, an act of normal social courtesy from a human who didn't know any better than to treat her like any other person, had fundamentally changed her life. James's friendship had broken through centuries of isolation, reminded her she was more than just her role as feared queen. The loneliness remained, but it was no longer absolute. James reflected on how his instinct to include someone who looked isolated had led to one of the most meaningful friendships of his life. He'd learned that fear-based assumptions about entire species often missed the actual individuals behind those assumptions, that even the most powerful beings could be profoundly lonely, and that sometimes the simplest human gestures, treating someone with basic kindness, could have impacts that rippled far beyond their initial moment. A reminder that compassion can disarm even the most dangerous legends, that isolation is